Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at our virtual 2020 Board Leaders Convening Reimagined session. Today, our main topic will be Impact Investing. The S in ESG takes center stage. Thank you for joining. So before we get started, I want to thank our presenting sponsor and diamond sponsor, KPMG, for their great support in supporting the whole series of convening reimagined sessions that have taken place starting this summer. Thank you, KPMG. And today's session sponsor, Goldman Sachs, for their support, for their creativity in the development of this session, and just being a partner. Thank you. We also, just as a matter of call, ask you please to mute the microphone. Everyone, including those who are ruffling paperwork in front of the microphones, you can please keep your microphone on mute. You are more than welcome to keep your video on. We'd like to see all those smiling faces who have joined us. We also want to actively engage or encourage you to join us using the chat feature if you have any questions or comments that you want to make to the general audience, but more specifically to our speakers as we go along with the discussion and conversation today. And want to do a reminder that we exercise Chatham House rules so that everything that is discussed stays here today, and nothing is quoted without the permission of the actual speaker making the comment. I want to hand it over today to, for our conversation, to our distinguished moderator, LCDA member, Tere Alvarez Canida, who will be facilitating today's session. She's a principal at CITO Capital Group and director at Kemper. So with that, Tere, I want to hand over the reins to you to go ahead and set up the discussion and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. I want to thank you and Esther and LCDA, not only for the panel today, but for really being such an important part of our business every day and keeping us up to date with relevant information during this very difficult times. Everyone, thank you for joining us today as we talk about impact investing, which I'm sure, as you know, refers to investments made in companies, organizations, foundations, and funds with the intentions of generating a measurable, beneficial, social, or environmental impact along a financial return. Never has this been more relevant and important. This is something close to my heart and a lot of you out there. Those of you involved in impact investing, it is important because businesses can and must be a greater force for the good, and that market must be able to be part of the solution. And the reason it must be part of the solution is that business accounts for about $19 trillion of US private investments. Compared to the government, it's 40 times the size of government and a lot higher than other areas such as foundations. Building a just and equal economy that better serves the needs of all stakeholders is an essential step in pursuing true prosperity for all and addressing our nation's systemic problems. We must address these issues. As we mentioned, we are at a crossroads today, and as directors and CEOs, we need to make a change, and we need to make sure that that change impacts all the stakeholders and the communities at large. As directors, we need to show up, to motivate, and to continue to push for these changes. We have two great panelists with us today, both who have been involved in this area of investments for their careers. I think it will be very interesting. I'm sure you have read their extensive bios, which are in the back of our program today. They have long personal careers and trajectories that will help us better understand the issues that we address today. I want to thank both of them for participating. I will let them both tell you a little bit about their career. John, why don't you go first, please?
Hey, Terry, thanks so much for the introduction, and so great to be here, and excited to get to share some of this and look forward to everybody's questions. So I have a bit of a fortuitous winding road, and I feel really fortunate to get to do what I do with the people with whom I get to work, both within our organization, with partners, like LCDA and others. So I probably most relevantly, I was, like to say, unsuccessfully trying to take time off and moved out to California in 2007. And after realizing that succeeded in making both me and my wife profoundly unhappy, I was lucky enough that in the same week, the Kellogg Foundation, Google.org, and a large family office, I'll say, can you help us figure out this whole emerging topic of impact investing? And I partnered with the chief investment officer of the Royal Steiner Foundation named Taylor Jordan. And we started with a little two-person firm that over 8 years worked with 11 of the 25 largest US foundations, got to really dig into the meat of this subject, both thematic areas around financial inclusion, education, health, and climate, but cross-cutting issues around racial equity. There's nothing like having someone like the Kellogg Foundation as really your first anchor client to really have you dive deep into that as an area of fundamental importance. So our tiny two-person turned 15-person firm started getting hired by financial institutions. And this is a little bit of a sign of the development of the field, right? As this went from niche to a little less niche-y, we started getting hired by banks, asset managers, insurers, and others. And one of those banks had the rather surprising suggestion, instead of becoming a client, what if they were to buy us? And so the rather surprising proposition of the 15-person impact investing company got acquired by Goldman Sachs Asset Management in 2015. So then I got to spend about 4 years with a growing set of teammates focused on this question of really three things. Number one, the world is changing, right? We're getting clear on the fundamental business case around diversity, around climate efficiency, around all of these topics. How do we just weave a deeper awareness of this changing world and drivers of financial and operational success into just how we invest? Not for ESG products, not for labeled products, but just how we invest. So weave it into the day-to-day investing. Number two, if you're not moving forward, you're standing still, right? And so how do we have an R&D agenda to partner with clients to lean into these themes, do more tailored, customized work, from having a money market fund that works with diverse counterparties, all the way to investing private capital to solve community problems and all points in between, and finally help navigate this confusing topic for clients. And then about 2 years ago, our leadership saw we had all this activity going around the firm, all this activity going around the world, but we need to up our game. And so now I was asked to lead the sustainable finance group. And so there are 10 of us in the executive office working to take really the top-down focus that climate transition and inclusive growth are fundamental drivers of economic success in the decades ahead. And how do we really accelerate the efforts within each of our divisions and then bring them together for clients? So what it means is concretely, and a lot of what you're going to be hearing today comes from probably spending 2/3 of my time talking to corporate boards, C-suite, to asset managers and allocators kind of across that spectrum, and the other third working to sort of operationalize that with colleagues within the firm. And so that's also done externally. We're targeting $750 billion of sustainable finance in the next 10 years, and look forward to walking through what that looks like day to day.
Thank you, Don, very much, Ralph. You've had the boots in the ground with AT&T for many years. This was always in your DNA and part of what you created. You're also on the board of a number of companies. Tell us a little bit about your background and
Yeah, of course, Terry. First of all, it's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you and with John, who is a pioneer in this field. What I'm doing now is I am the chairman and founder of the De La Vega Group, which is my own company. The De La Vega Group focuses on investments and advice to small startup companies that have a noble purpose, that solve difficult problems and do so with innovative technology. And I'm having a blast working with young entrepreneurs, helping them scale, and really sustainability is a key thing that we look for. Before that, I was the vice chairman of AT&T and the CEO of Business Solutions and International, serving AT&T's business operations in over 200 countries. And then before that, I was the chief executive officer for AT&T Mobility, one of the world's largest mobile carriers. To give you context of why I feel so strongly about this area of diversity and inclusion, the team that I led over the last 10 years from 2004 to 2014 at AT&T Mobility delivered 50 billion of revenues in that time of year. 50 billion increase in revenues over a 10-year period, or 5 billion every year for 10 years. We delivered 23 billion in EBITDA over that same span. And we won the J.D. Power Award for the customer retail satisfaction 9 times in a row. One of the key things in leading that growth is the fact that we put in practices that made sure that we had people from the segments we wanted to penetrate be part of our leadership team. And I am as proud of accomplishments in that area as I have anything else, because we, at the end of my tenure there, we were #1 market share in the Hispanic market for postpaid wireless service. We were #1 market share for the African American market in postpaid wireless service. And we were #1 in the Asian market for postpaid wireless service. So I believe in diversity and inclusion because it works. It helps businesses grow, in addition to being the right thing to do from an ethical and moral point of view.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Let's get into ESG and current trends. Thank you both. We will explore where we are, where we're headed. John, tell us how you define ESG and what are the trends and results that Goldman is seeing in this area?
Yeah, so I figured sort of we'll kind of mention 3 things. Kind of 1, what is it? 2, where is it coming from? And 3, kind of what do we see in the market in terms of activity? I think Ralph gave, in some ways, the best definition. This is where we like to ground it. Often, one of the challenges with ESG is it's an acronym that leads people to think, I need to learn this foreign language, right? I need to kind of change out of my work clothes and get into something else, right? And I think what we found is that labeling something can try to lift it up, but it can also marginalize it and push it to the periphery. And Ralph just explained, in business terms, not ESG terms, why this matters. Growing the top line, driving profits, right? And so when we think about ESG, we really look at it as the world is changing, right? Climate transition, inclusive growth are massive levers. And at the end of the day, it's not necessarily about E versus S versus G. It's why does it matter economically? Is it around risk? Is it around growth? Or is it around efficiency? What's the economic lever that means this changing world matters, and how do I navigate that effectively for today and into the future? Ralph gave a great example. We can go through lots of examples of that, but I think often it's kind of getting out of acronym, I have to study, get out my glossary land, and just have a business conversation, particularly for boards. I think we find that's so important. Is this isn't, get out your glossary and learn things. So what is it? It's navigating a changing world for risk, return, and efficiency, particularly around those 2 broad themes, #1. #2, where's it coming from? I think when we particularly sat down with a board last year at our leadership to really ground this next stage in our effort, we said, look, we see a growing diverse set of drivers, and that's consumer preferences. We have a changing consumer demographic, as Ralph was talking about, who want to buy different types of products from different types of companies, right? And there are different ways to understand and tap into those markets. Those folks aren't just consumers, they're also workers. The war for talent. How do you attract and retain the right talent that increasingly is passionate about these kinds of issues? Asset managers increasingly are putting pressure on companies for performance on this and are choosing who they buy and who they don't buy on this. Regulators from Europe to Asia are getting in on this game. Companies themselves, right? When Walmart says it wants to be net zero across its supply chain without offsets, you may not think you have an environmental target, but if you want to sell through Walmart, now you do, right? And so all these drivers, #1. #2, businesses. What do businesses want to do? They want to grow, they want to be efficient, they want to manage risk. And just the relevance of this commercially, leave aside if anyone else in the world cares. Just when you're looking for those levers to optimize your business, it makes sense. And 3, consequences. When we don't make progress on these things, when we have persistent economic inequality, racial inequity, that is not a sustainable basis for society or for the economy. We see the same thing on climate. I just got done spending a month in central Missouri instead of California because of smoke from wildfires. So these reminders that it's not just economically critical that we make progress on this. There's a fundamentally imperative. Our CEO, David Solomon, talks about as this dual, the sort of opportunity and the imperative that are together. And that's what Ralph talked about. There's an economic driver, but it's also important. So what are we seeing in the market? To give you a sense of where this market is, year to date, ESG equity funds have 87 billion of net inflows. Non-ESG, everything else, 123 billion of net outflows. On the fixed income side, 75 billion of inflows for ESG versus 5 for everything else. And in some ways, for me, one of the most telling stats of kind of why we're here, why we're talking about this. Passive investing, on the rise, growing and significant. Market share of ESG within passive investing was basically 0 for a long time. 2017, it was 1%. 2018, it was 3%. 2019, it was 14%. And year to date, it's north of 40%. So that's a little bit what it is, just core economic drivers in a changing world, what's underlying it, and then what we're starting to see in the market.
Ralph, John is so right. But let me ask you a question. When you sit at the boards that you sit on, do people understand the relevance of this more than it's something that goes into proxy, it's something that we have to, write an ESG policy? Are people beginning to understand and have the courage as directors to stand up and speak up about these issues?
Yeah, I'm kind of blessed that I serve on boards that are diverse, and the discussions are quite healthy. And we have people from different backgrounds chiming in and challenging the company when appropriate. How are we doing in this area? What is the strategy? What are we doing to capture this market or that market? Now, the discussion today has really focused around this huge issue of pay equity, as you know, both from a gender and an ethnicity point of view. So I see the board getting very engaged in understanding what we're going to do to have board replacement strategies that lead to the company's board being more diverse and reflective of the customer base it is trying to serve. The same thing goes from diversity and inclusion, making sure that at the board level and at the executive level, we're thinking in the future. And like John said, there's a war for talent out there, not just at the board level, but at every other level. And I think one of the challenges that is beginning to surface, Teddy, is in what John was referring to, this war for talent, but it's about a war for the skills that are going to be needed in the future. The future of work is changing before our eyes. And I think there's going to be a significant movement if we believe in the World Economic Forum that says 54% of the jobs are going to have to be upskilled or reskilled between now and 2022. There's a huge upheaval coming in terms of not only how do you keep the current force you have, but how do you upskill it and reskill it to take into account the incredibly fast-paced change taking place in demographics, in technology, in regulations, in competition, and in the political climate. It is one of the most complex environments that I've ever seen, either as a CEO or a board member, in trying to deal with the right things to do to serve your customers, to make sure your employees are well taken care of, and to ensure that your shareholders are getting an adequate return at a time when there's risk all around, including risk to the company's reputation, its brand. So I think we'll talk more about that as we get into issues related to COVID, but those are kind of the themes that I see running day in and day out in a lot of the corporate boards that I sit on.
Thank you, Ralph, for helping me into the next question. John, how has the pandemic accelerated or changed the focus on ESG?
Yeah, and look, I'll have to say, I mean, we in our line of work, we were sort of holding our breath in the pandemic for beyond all the sort of very human reasons that kind of what happens to the focus on all of these topics that we've seen is so important. Because when I talked to a lot of clients towards the end of last year, a lot of them towards the end of me would say, you know what, I think, is this really hype? Is this a bull market phenomenon, right? That ultimately this is great when times are good, but when times get rough, this is all gonna melt. And that was a fundamental barrier to the long-term grounding and growth of this. And I think, frankly, the field needed a stress test, and in Q1, it and the world got one. And I think what's interesting is when we look at Q1, 44% of ESG funds were in the top quartile, 11% were in the bottom quartile. 24 out of 26 ESG passive funds outperformed their non-ESG counterparts. And importantly, the biggest driver of that was not being underweight, say, oil in a rough quarter for oil or overweight tech in a good quarter for tech. It was actually security-specific differentiation of companies that were strong on this and weak on this. Then the next question is, well, will it keep up in a rally, right? And so then Q2, ESG held its own, outperformed, not by as much, but little. So for the overall first half of the year, when we look at the data, 43% of ESG funds top quartile, 9% bottom quartile, and all 26 out of the 26 sort of major ETFs outperformed. And so that COVID stress test, I think it passed. It doesn't magically mean this is pixie dust to sprinkle on a portfolio, but it addressed a kind of a fundamental concern, number one. Number two, more fundamentally, it was a reminder of these things that sometimes people think of as non-financial, quality governance, resilience, all of these elements that occasionally get labeled as non-financial can get really financial really fast, right? That ultimately being able to navigate a changing world is at a real premium. And this idea that could things that I didn't always think matter a lot to a portfolio matter a lot? Oh yeah, I guess they can. And I think three, and we're going to talk about this later, it gave a little more balance in the sense of, somebody asked me the other day, one of our leaders is like, well, did when the pandemic did kind of, the environment take a backseat to S? And the way I put it is, deservedly S just kind of climbed into the front seat with E, right? And I think back to kind of a shared space, and we'll get into this, but just because the data may be harder, that means we need to work more on it, not less on it. And we'll get a little bit into some of those issues as the conversation unfolds.
Okay, thank you. And moving right along, we're going to get to the E, to the S in ESG.
Let me make a comment to
Okay,
COVID,
sure,
Ted, because I think that I wanted to highlight something. Sitting there at the corporate board, watching us go through the COVID crisis, and many companies not being able to forecast financials anymore. Things were so crazy and chaotic that we couldn't forecast. And I remember one of our companies discussing this with their top investor, and what he said really resonated with me. It says, look, you cannot focus on this quarter's earnings. You have to focus on supporting your employees, taking care of your customers, and protecting the brand of this company. If you do anything different than that, I'm going to have a problem with it. And so it really brought this aspect of, I would call it humanity in business, that John referred to as the S in the front seat, where businesses all of a sudden focus on making sure their employees were healthy, that you had a healthy environment for customers to do business with you, and to make sure that you protect the company's brand at a time when not only are you dealing with a pandemic and health issue, tremendous financial pressures, in addition to the social justice issues, so that any missteps in any one of those three could get you on the front page of a newspaper overnight and really make major brand damage. So making sure that we had humanity in business, that we avoided layoffs when possible, and acting on those principles. I think crisis, in my opinion, always brings out the best of us. And it really did this in an incredible fashion. Our essential workers, the people who supported us in the front lines, did an unbelievable job of recovering from the chaos, and now we're slowly getting back.
It was funny. I was just on the front, and even how you framed it. I was doing some climbing with Tim Ingracia, who helps one of the leaders in our investment bank, and he said when he's advising clients during that period, he said, you're going to be remembered for two things when the history of you, your leadership, your company is written: liquidity and humanity. Those are the two things you're going to be evaluated on. So take care of both, and we'll get on with it, right? So I think that's very much consistent with what we saw as successful, and I think companies who took that path, I think, are seeing some of the benefits.
Yeah, in the companies that I have seen, John, the engagement of the employee has never been better, and the same thing with the customers who appreciated giving them a break when they needed it. That to me means volumes, because they'll remember you in the bad times. Right. That you help them during the bad times and be loyal to you in the good times. I think that's basic business 101 during crisis.
Yes. Yep. I agree with you both. And I think to continue talking about the S, the current pandemic and also the social unrest that we've been going on has placed U.S. corporations at a crossroads with rapidly shifting expectations, like we've been talking about. Although most Americans, 60%, agree that companies are stepping up to protect the health, safety, and economic security of the workforce during the COVID-19 pandemic, almost 9 in 10 Americans agree that this is a tremendous opportunity for companies to hit the reset. And it's what both of you are talking about. Yes, we have reacted, and I'm on a board, and I too, I am amazed at how well the humanity came through and how well the employees have reacted. But the question is, it gives us an opportunity, as I mentioned, to hit the reset. And what's so important is that the reset be continued, and not after the pandemic goes away and things go back to normal and the economy gets better, that we go back to doing things the wrong way. So I think it is the role of companies to continue to promote the S and ESG as good governance, and to make sure that going forward, this stays relevant, that we, and we talked about this, and we'll talk more about this, that we create objectives, not quotas, but objectives, that we create accountability to make sure that we're executing. And I'm not sure how we measure that, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but it's so important that the reset button not be unreset, if that's the way to put it. So John, in the world and the companies that you're dealing with, how is ESG viewed on the world stage? And again, the future of it, not as a policy that a company has in a proxy statement, but as a living, as part of your DNA. So
yeah. So good news, and then some work to do, right? So I think the good news is this transition from the periphery to the core, from a sustainability head or a chief diversity officer to the CEO, CFO, and board. I think that is well and constructively underway, number one. Number two, and I just think about my own meetings. Who wants to meet with me? Who wants to sit down with my team, right? You know, it is sitting down with boards in the C-suite. It's not the people who have any label on this in their title. So I think that's good and that's important, number one. Number two, we're still underway and we're making progress, but we're not done yet in grounding it, you know, in the way Ralph talks and thinks about it, not in I'm learning some jargon from a book, right? Understand this is a central business issue. It's not an acronym. And I think we're moving in the right direction, but there's still some work to do, because for a long time, evangelists of ESG may have not come from the core of the financial services sector, may have not always totally understood the context in the companies or the groups they were working with, and may have done a little bit of finger wagging that led people to have concern, skepticism, and think that this was different from their core job of driving long-term value, right? And so there's still a little bit of that grounding in the frame. It's not about the acronym, it's about the business. It's not about a piece of the business, it's the core of your purpose, right? And we're having more of those conversations, I'm finding. Actually, interesting people are saying, like, look, at Goldman, you just spent the last 18 months trying to figure out how to really continue to accelerate and ground this at the core of your purpose. Walk us through that. What worked, what didn't? I think that stage, the good news is that's where people are at, but it takes some work. And then finally, when it's a real business issue, it's like any business issue. Business is hard. It's a competitive, tough environment out there. Investing is hard. It's a competitive, tough environment. So clearing that underbrush of confusion, clearing away the distraction of putting this off in a corner is important and necessary. Grounding at the core is key, but in some ways that's when the real work can start, if that matters. But I think that the genie is out of the bottle, right? This is not going back. It's a question of developing the skill, capability as a central issue, and that's not going to happen overnight, but it's happening.
John, I wanted to add to that, because that's exactly my thinking is, we're not going back to the way it was. And all of us, I think, have to think at times, this is just a brief period in time and then we're going to go back. But I think there's one thing that has made a tremendous impact that I never thought it would make in terms of social justice. And that is these devices that we have on our hands that we use up every day called smartphones. Smartphones have done something that up until now we've not been able to see, and that is they're shedding light on injustice everywhere there is injustice, and they're broadcasting it everywhere. An injustice anywhere today can be broadcast everywhere. That changes everything. There's no going back. And I think it begins to show people the built-in racism that is inherent in some systems. And that if we as individuals don't take the leadership role in breaking that down, then this will never change. So to me, it's more than just a corporate or a director level. This is personal. If we don't speak up, and when we see racism taking place, then we're not doing our job. If you're not comfortable in discussing a racial issue with one of your peers or colleagues, we're not doing our job. And if we're part of an organization that practices racism, shame on us if they don't have a diverse group that we're supporting. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do ourselves. We don't have to wait for any act of Congress to pass. There's things that we can do as individuals today to shed light on injustice and make sure that everybody is held accountable, and there's no need to push the reset button anymore. I don't think there's any going back. No way of going back.
Ralph, I agree with you. Can you just talk a little bit about things that in your past you put, that you did, that you're talking about, that you think companies should really put in place to make sure that we don't go back and to make sure that that accountability is there? Just give us a few examples that people can.
Well, let me tell you, if you ask me how did I learn that diversity and inclusion pays, I'll give you the one story that changed my trajectory. And it happened in a small country called Ecuador when I was running its wireless business there. The country was not performing well. And when I went and visited the country, there was a lot of men in the leadership position, not a single woman, mostly mature. And we were not performing well in the youth market. We made a tough decision then to reorganize the country and have a segment that we call the youth segment, defined as 25 years or younger. And we made the decision that that segment would report to the CEO, and it had to be headed by somebody from the segment. So I put a 22-year-old young lady in charge of the P&L of this group. And she changed everything. She changed the colors of the product. She changed the distribution from retail stores to shopping centers. She hired an all-girls band to promote the product. And when she showed me the first advertising campaign for it, I told her I didn't like it. She looked at me and she said, "Ralph, you're not the target." And you know what? I believed in her. And I let her, this is the power of inclusion. You let her, I said, I have faith in you. I'm going to put the marketing dollars behind you. And the next thing that happened, our sales went up. Our text messages per capita went through the roof. I had to call the internal audit team to double check the numbers. But Ecuador became the second highest country in the world in text messaging per capita. And that all happened because we wanted to attack a segment and we put somebody from that segment. That segment in Ecuador was called the cool segment, 25 or younger. And the bottom line principle here is if you're older than 25 and you think you're cool, you're not. So don't try to, you can't think young. You have to have somebody young represent you. Just like if you're trying to attack the Hispanic market. How could you not have a Hispanic leading that segment, or an African-American leading the marketing segment, and an Asian, the same thing? What we did to get us the #1 position in those 3 markets was to put leaders of those backgrounds in charge and to invest in those communities. We built state-of-the-art stores in Hispanic communities, in African-American communities, and in Asian communities. And we built them as good as any store we ever had. I still really prize the key to the city that the mayor Huntington Park in LA gave me, because we built this great store in that Hispanic community, and it turned out to be one of the best stores in terms of productivity that we've ever had. So this effort begins by putting people from the segment to lead the segment and investing in the communities, and the rest is magic.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for sharing this story. It's very relevant and I think very, very important for us to put it in place. Now let's talk a little bit about inclusion, racial equity, as well as measuring the impact. In the US, our history and our society looks very different to other countries. One of the big distinctions is the large number of US Latinos and their contribution to the country and the economy. With the growing Latino markets in the US, it's smart business. It's the right thing to do to have representation in companies and on boards. But again, one of the issues that we have is getting corporations to disclose the racial composition of their boards and their employees, and it continues to be a challenge. So how do we create companies and boards that are more inclusive? Again, that this becomes part of the DNA, and that they're transparent in their discussion of these statistics. Ralph, back to you. How can impact investing drive the inclusion and disclosure? And then
No,
I'll let John take us.
Yeah, sure. Look, I don't see why a board would not want to disclose the ethnicity or the gender of its board members. It doesn't make any sense to me. I would instead be proud to show the diversity of the boards that I serve on. But I think that part of what we need to do, Tere, especially when it comes to Latinos, is I'm frustrated that a lot of the facts that would promote people to initiate action without being prodded, we'll talk about being prodded in a minute, are not well known. It is not well known that the Hispanic or the Latino GDP is 2.6 trillion. That was what it was in 2018. If it was a country of its own, that Latino cohort would be the 8th largest GDP in the world, bigger than Italy, bigger than Brazil, bigger than South Korea. Among the world's 10 largest GDPs, the Latino GDP would be the fastest growing of those 10 countries, growing 21% faster than India and 30% faster than China, totaling a cohort of almost 61 million people. And those under 16, those Latinos under 16 represent 26% of the population. If I give you those numbers, how could you not be thinking about how do I attract that market? Because I think they're almost linked to any company's success. You can't ignore 26% in the case of young Latinos of the total available market. You can, but I don't think you're going to be as successful. So we need to communicate, and I have spent a lot of my personal time and effort trying to communicate these facts. But then if companies don't react to this, Daddy, and this is what I think you were getting to, I think we must insist that they have some kind of reporting mechanism through the governance process or getting the investors to demand it. I think there's, from my point of view, I don't see a valid reason why we should not be doing that.
John, when you talk to companies and you do consulting, I mean, everybody talks about an inclusive culture. I mean, I don't think anybody talks against it. But again, putting things in place, putting the structures in place that become part of the company culture and that create opportunities such as recruiting, mentoring, making sure that you're building a pipeline so that you can't say, well, I can't do it because I don't have the talent. I mean, why can we get this done? Why has it taken us so long to get this done?
So it's sort of, I mean, and we were talking earlier, Ralph, for me, one of my biggest pet peeves is when people talk about the barriers. They're not barriers, it's the work, right? And I think sort of that we let people talk about, and they say we have a pipeline problem. It's like, no, what you really mean to say is you are failing at your job to get a great set of candidates. So I think it's just, let's get the framing right on that level. And I think on Ralph's point, let's get it from the periphery, as this is one of the many things that are nice to do, to like, at the core, those numbers Ralph just walked through are pretty compelling, right? Sort of let's reground it at the core and not have it at the periphery. So sort of let's understand it's not a barrier, it's the work, and the reason we're doing the work is core to the business, it's not at the periphery. That's number one. So number two, what follows from that is there's some pretty direct levers. So when we look at it, we think, what are the direct levers we can apply? So, Catherine Winter, who leads global stewardship, has, initially had conversations with it, and she will vote against the nominating committee chairs of boards that lack diversity, right? Because who should be fixing this? That's who should be fixing it. Similarly, our CEO came out with this pledge around, we're not going to take companies that lack diversity on the board public, one diverse board member in the US and Europe, but that's ramping up over time. But the third part of that is, okay, you take these big levers of how we're interacting with the economy and we ask for more. Part of that is also being willing to help. So we've been really thankful for LCDA, and particularly Ozzy and Esther, who've worked with Ilana on our side, to really say when, because we had some of those nominating committee chairs call us, say, before you vote against me, can you help? Right? And so Ilana is leading an effort to really, work with LCDA and others to say, like, great, let's go and we'll help you. right? We're not just going to say you're on your own. We'll help you get that boost. We'll work to create a good, set of candidates and help solve the problem. So that's number one, is sort of engage with the full core of our business, both to push, but also to help. The second thing is to realize there are lots of ways to touch this value chain, right? In terms of allocators of capital, investors of capital, and companies. And then, is it who owns that? Is it who leads it? Is it who sort of manages and operates it day to day, or who benefits? And I think often we'll focus just on one piece or the other. And honestly, it's all of those and different ways to push. And so we took one of our money market funds and we partnered with, with JetBlue, Starbucks, and Apple, and said, actually, let's change who we transact with. So more than 60% of those securities are bought from diverse broker dealers, for example. We're bringing them into investment banking transactions as selling brokers. All these other things. How do we kind of lean in different parts of that ecosystem, realizing it's not one piece or the other? The third is, how do we get upstream of the challenge, both as we recruit and develop people internally? But I'm thinking about initiatives like Launch at GS, right? Which is, at the end of the day, if we want a robust, growing universe of institutional money managers that are owned by, led by, and managed by diverse talent, we got to plant some of those seeds ourselves, right? So we've carved out capital both for companies and for money managers to help build that whole ecosystem, number one. Number two, we also integrate basically real engagement on diversity in our manager selection process broadly. If we're going to allocate capital to a fund manager, it's not just give us some numbers, we'll write them in a book and we'll move on, right? Step one, we do need to count. Step two, it's beyond counting. It gets to culture. It gets to all those other things. Number three, this is not the last time we're having this conversation, right? And so really looking at kind of those three things is, how do we get it from the periphery to the core and use kind of the bigger muscles we have as a firm? And this applies, it looks differently for different institutions, but it's true for all of us, number one. Number two, it's a system, and we touch that system in lots of ways. And sometimes it requires a little creativity. Think about that money market fund, sometimes a little more direct. And step three, sometimes you got to plant your own seeds, right? You got to kind of grow the garden before you can, hopefully help everybody benefit from it.
And
One thing
John,
I wanted to add to that comment, to add to it, you highlighted that it's just work, and it is work trying to plan for it. I can't tell you how many times in my career I've had the same comment of, well, we don't have a pipeline, we don't have people that are ready. I have refused to accept it, and to the point that when I restructured the company, I purposely built small markets so that we would have a place where it would be safe to bring somebody who was non-traditional. Phoenix may be a small market, but not New York City or Chicago or LA. So we built small markets to allow non-traditionals to come into that organization and show they could run a P&L, show they could manage a capital budget. And in doing so, we created so many leaders that some of the top leaders we have that I've worked with came from that development over the many years that I worked at AT&T, for example. So it can be done. It is work, and there's no excuse for doing the work that is needed if you believe in the price at the end of that work effort.
And analog, Ralph, to your point about small market, I think the other thing we've been doing as we work to build up both formal and informal mentorship networks is adding sort of tangible skills and things to the toolkit. So one of the things, I have a growing set of mentors because right now sustainable finance is a really hot and growing topic. So if we want to develop talent, arming them with something that we know is important and then can give them a platform, right, has a particular power. So it's getting that deliberateness throughout the process.
And by the way, it's a two-way street, because I think when you mentor somebody, you can be reverse mentored, especially by somebody who doesn't look like you, doesn't have your same background and culture. I found that to be absolutely enlightening to me. I'm mentoring a young person right now. He happens to be a software developer in Python, artificial intelligence, and we have a wonderful relationship back and forth. He's mentoring me on AI, and I'm mentoring him on other things in life. But it's great, and it's good to have two-way mentoring because it helps both people in the mentoring exchange, if you will.
Ralph, I think you just hit on a point. I think it's not only the recruiting, but the mentoring. And I think, again, the question that we must ask when we sit on a board to our CEOs and to the company is, show us what's going on in management, like senior management level, all different levels, and how are we filling that pipeline to make sure that when we're going to replace the CIO or the CFO, and we have talent, diverse talent that can go for that job.
I know some of the things that we used to do, Tada, that we're not doing now is we would have these people come to the board breakfast or the board lunch or the board dinner and have a special setting where they could have a chance to meet board members and board members who get to meet them. As I've talked to other board members since we've gone virtual, it can be done, but it's just not the same. And I hope that one of these days we can get back to that environment where you can bring young people up. And I tell you, it's career changing when you have them exposed and they get to understand what a board member thinks like.
Just one quick question to you, John, and then we'll move to the next topic because we're running up against time. We could have had this for 3 hours and filled up the whole time. But John, going back to data, which I hate the word and I hate to bring it up, but I think it's important, as a way of measuring. It's a lot easier to measure the part E versus the S in ESG. And when you talk to companies and you consult them, are you trying to put together some benchmarks that can be used, again, to make sure that we have the pipeline, that we have the board, that we have, it's not just about the board, it's all the way from the bottom to the top. And as you think about this, are there relevant points that you'd like to share with us?
So look, I think the point you made is critical. And I think the question there, as I said on data, is it's kind of like, don't wait for it and don't stop once you have it, but realize it's important and we got to work to get it, right? So I think, in the absence of uniformly disclosed data on things that are important, let's find other ways to get insight. So for example, our quant investment team realized that if they suck down all the data from Glassdoor and other sources, and they use their natural language processing kind of AI engine on it, they can learn a lot about workforce, employees, engagement, culture. They can learn an awful lot, right? And they've published a little paper on it, and they've actually added it to how they manage money because they find that incremental insight is useful. And then once companies hear that matters, that's an interesting data point to kind of feed back to them. We're working on some of the infrastructure in the industry. So SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, having a dedicated group trying to build out the metrics on this. Because the good news is there's a rising push from a whole host of investors to have sort of more material standard data on things that matter. We're just not quite there yet for a lot of things on the human capital side. And so we're part of a smaller group of investors that are really trying to figure out how do we get a set and get them out in the world relatively quickly. And so I think some of the train tracks are laid for it, but that's one where we're working on the content. And so I think it's a combination of be creative with what we have today, keep asking questions, and then try to hone the more standardized asks. Because at the end of the day, data is the lifeblood of markets, and we all need it to function more effectively. And I think there's a risk that we get into sort of, questionnaire fatigue, which is, I talked to one CFO of a company who said, I see a lot of smiles and nods when I said that, by the way, which means that I'm not alone. But I talked to the CFO of a company. She said she'd been asked for 2,000 different ESG data points in the last 12 months. Right. And I just get those stack questions. And I think the answer is we need better data reported on the things that matter in a more coherent form versus this patchwork quilt. And I think we're working pretty hard with a bunch of folks to try to overcome that. But it's, we're back to Ralph's point. It's the work, right? But look, what in business and investing is easy, right? So this is no less important and no different.
Thank you very much. And our last topic, which I think is very important, many of the participants on this call are board members, and I'm sure they'd like to hear a bit about the board's role in making ESG a governance priority. How can we increase not just the numbers, but the quality of board qualified talent? Again, people who have the courage to stand up in the boardroom and do the right thing. Ralph, again, you're involved in a lot of boards. You've done great work when you were at AT&T. In addition to diversity and making the commitment to racial equality, what can and boards should do, again, to make this a priority, to make sure it doesn't get left for the last 1 minute of the board meeting, but that it takes the time and attention that's necessary?
I think it takes the board working together as a team to what I call inspect what you expect. If you expect to have certain outcomes, you should be able to inspect it and demand that management give you why this is happening or not happening. I think what has really encouraged me in the last year or so is the members that we're bringing on the board are more diverse than I've ever seen before. We're recruiting people that are just not at the CEO level, even though that's always a primary choice, but going below the CEO level, picking people from C-suites to get diversity of age, of thinking, of ethnicity, of gender, and just the fact that people are coming out from completely different perspectives lends something that I've never seen before in terms of the dynamics that are going on, because you know that these new board members have a completely different point of view. I think my only frustration is that it just takes time, as I'm sure many who look at it on the outside. And I think what I've seen some boards do now that I think is excellent, some of the ones that I serve on actually going above the board recommended number of directors. If they see a good candidate that would add to the mix, they're going ahead and adding that candidate, knowing that they're going to have somebody come off the board 2 years from now or 3 years from now. We're bringing that overlap in if we can get somebody who is highly qualified that meets the diversity criteria. And that has been successful, and almost every board that I sit on has done that to some extent or another.
I think that actually, at that point, it's so resonant. There's a company whose board I'm working with. That's exactly what they did. They lacked the diversity that they knew they needed for success, and they looked at the schedule on the forward, and they started digging, found good people, and they found good people, and they said, we're going to take them now.
Exactly.
Like, we're not going to wait because we're going to benefit today. We might lose the chance to get them if we wait. So let's just go. And yeah, our board's going to be a little bigger than we'd like for the next, certainly 12 months and to a degree over time, but like, let's go. Right. And so it's just, that example is really resonant because I've just seen that with one client. There's another one that's going through the same thing.
I think the other thing that I like to add, and Ralph, you can answer. I think we also, as Latino and as Afro-Americans sitting on boards, need to make sure that we encourage and we bring along people that we know that would be good directors, also Latino and Afro-American. We shouldn't be afraid, right? I mean, for many years, it was all country club friends that were on boards. And, we should have, the courage, again, to stand up and do that and not be afraid to say, hey, I met so-and-so years ago. He's great at this area. Take a look at him. And I think we need to encourage each other to do a lot more of that.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. And I think we need to get beyond the days when we have one minority on the board and that checks the box. That's no longer acceptable in my point of view. You need to have a representative group that represents the customers you're trying to attract.
Well, and I think just to put another plug in for the work Alana's doing. So as folks have those candidates, those people they think would be great for board, as LCD has done, continue to send them to Alana, because I think this is something we see there is a huge need and a huge opportunity, and we're excited to kind of play the role that we can. And I think it's also realizing that there are also, I think, two things that can help a little bit. I think one is kind of look at the skill relative to the sort of some of the tick box CV elements, right? Is it really about having someone that was a CEO, or do you need someone that understands cyber now, or tech, or marketing? Like, is there a skill set that you need that's less around, they have this, is it ticking the skill box as opposed to the what elevation they've had box, which I think can help a little bit, number one. Number two, I think for us, we also have a private investment business. So we work with financial sponsors in the private equity space that have boards. It's maybe somebody could use a stepping stone to a public company board, start a private company board, right? I think it's kind of expand the set of what we're looking for and expand the set of places that give people an on-ramp to what sometimes can feel like kind of a remote, closed-off system.
John, you just hit upon something that to me is the magic word, and you hit upon the need for skills. And that same need for skills, whether they be cyber for the board or cyber for the company, to me is what the future of work is all about. The days when you can just get somebody with a master's degree in a broad topic, as opposed to getting somebody that can perform the job you need them to perform is really critical. I think you know better than anybody else the amount of debt that we have because of college kids getting an education that is outrageously expensive, and then coming to the workplace and not even having all the skills that are needed in an ever-changing environment where the education you get today will be obsolete faster than any time in history. So the days when you can just look for, in my view, diplomas in something that school taught you that becomes obsolete very quickly in certain fields are behind us, and you need to focus on skills and skills development in your board and in your leadership team and in your company.
And I think all that takes us back to, again, doing the mentoring and making sure that the pipelines are being filled, that we help and educate where those skills are going to be, and that we make sure that we have Latinos, Afro-Americans, going for those skill sets so they can be part of the.
When I see in the chat, a lot of comments are rightly pointing out, it's it's not just mentorship. You also need sponsorship. You need coaching. You need all those pieces, and I think it's so important. I had a talk with one of my mentees on it, which is also some of you need to not be afraid to ask for sponsorship, right? Put people like me on the hook to go advocate for you, right? I think sometimes it's important to put some of the burden on some of us to deliver, right? We need to deliver that sponsorship, that growth. We need to advocate. We need to feel on the hook for when it comes to promotion time, comp time. Did we help achieve that goal, right? It's not just check in and hopefully have a mutually interesting, useful mentorship session. It's, try to also put us on the hook for delivering results for the people who we're providing sponsorship for.
I agree, John, and I think it's on us, on all of us here today to do that and to help. I mean, I never turn down a call from somebody who's asking me to help or asking me questions. I just think it's our duty to do that, to make sure that, again, that pipeline continues to grow.
By the way, Terry, let me just make a little bit of self-serving comment here, but this stuff works. Mentoring does work, but it's not just mentoring, it's giving people the opportunity to develop themselves. I recently heard back from two people that I had a relationship with. They used to work for me, where they became CEOs of their own company. Those two people made number 22 and 23 that worked for me, that either were a CEO or have been a CEO since they worked for me. Half of those were women and minorities. So I strongly believe in the statement of mentoring, but mentoring from the point of view is I'm going to give you an opportunity for you to show me what you can do. Put you in a position that is challenging and let you show the rest of the world your skills. When I have done that for people, they have excelled. Once everybody sees them, then everybody wants them and they want to run their businesses for them.
Thank you, John.
It works pretty well.
Yeah. Thank you, John and Ralph. And again, we could do this for a whole day and not be done. And it's so interesting and so important that we continue to harp on these topics. We'll open up for questions. The first question is from Carmen. Carmen, in your roles as Chief Financial Investment Officer with Chicago Teachers, and then with the Kellogg Foundation, you were an early pioneer in ESG investing. Please comment briefly on what you see going on in the ESG investing environment. And first of all, hello, Carmen and I go way back. We worked together since the early 90s, so it's great to reconnect, Carmen.
Yes, thank you so much, Tere. And thank you, Ralph and John. It's great to see you both and hear about your insights. Tere, as you know, I think back in the early 2000s, a lot of the pension funds here in Illinois were the ones that started ESG investing, as it's called now. We did a lot of investing that was focused towards social justice and also regional investments here. That was early 2000s. And I think what has changed, in the last 20 years of the impact investing is that there's greater clarity in terms of the truer alignment of the mission. As an investor, I think pension funds or foundations are more clear in terms of what do they actually want to achieve with their impact investing. Secondly, I think what I've seen is a much greater integration of the social impact discipline and also the investment discipline. I think John might agree. A lot of the impact investing got started, I think, maybe from advocacy organizations or grant makers and foundations, where they wanted to have some type of impact with the money that the organization had. However, the investment discipline didn't buy into it. That has completely changed. I certainly see a marriage of both disciplines, which can take this, much further than it ever has. There's also, from the investment part, people can can incorporate the ESG or impact investing into their process more quantitatively now, because there's better measurement of data. So previously it was just kind of a qualitative aspect. And lastly, there's quality and social measurement. We talked a little bit about data, and there's more clarity in terms of what is an output versus an outcome versus systems thinking. Systems thinking is more longer term thinking, and how can your investment today affect the system in the longer term. But lastly, I think the key point underlying all this is governance. And I think this is where LCDA has a big impact. What I like to say is, once you have the right G for the governance, then the E and the S should fall into place. So I think that's one of the major changes that has been happening as of late. So thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. And I was so excited to hear you. I didn't introduce you properly. That was Carmen Herrera Lopez who asked that question. Our second question, and Ralph and John, you can both take a shot at it. Can you share what company initiatives each of your companies, specifically your company that you work with or you're involved with, are doing to meet the needs of the Latino population specifically? The segment is critical today and in the near future on many fronts. So John, you want to take your first shot, tell us what Goldman is doing?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's really part and parcel of so much of what we've talked about, and it shows up in so many different parts of the business, right? And whether it's, looking at counterparties who we're trading with or buying securities from, and working with, Latino, Black, women-owned broker-dealers, whether it's including those counterparties in investment banking transactions, whether it's working as we're allocating capital, some of the managers with launch at GS, it really goes back to for us, it's the good thing is it's a long list, but it looks different in each part of our business based on how we touch the economy, as well as obviously having our own internal goals as well.
Ralph?
You're muted, Ralph.
You're mute.
That's the most famous word used in Zoom, is you're mute, you're on mute. I am very proud to serve on the board of New York Life, and New York Life has done something that is really amazing. They actually divested of international holdings and invested those assets in the market segments that are minority market segments in the US. And they have a tremendous success in the Hispanic marketplace, in the Asian marketplace. And in fact, it's really difficult to sell life insurance. It's really difficult in today's environment. And every year the company celebrates the top salesperson. Just about a year or two ago, the top salesperson was a young Latina from El Paso, Texas. That had never happened in the company's history, but it happened because New York Life had faith in the market. They bought people in and put them to run the market from the segment they're trying to acquire. I think it repeats itself in the Indian market. They have captured it totally. And again, the top salesperson for the company was a young lady from a background in India. It just highlights to me the power of diversity when you do it correctly. And I spoke to the volume of GDP growth in the US and the growth of the Latino segment. There's no better case than New York Life to highlight that they invested in that segment, and it's proven to be a huge success for them.
Thank you both. It's been a great panel. I think one thing that we can take away is the more diverse perspective your company has, the better and smarter and successful it's going to be. And we need to continue, every one of us needs to continue working in this direction. I want to thank Ralph de la Vega and John Goldstein It's been terrific getting to meet you both through Zoom and getting to work on this panel. I want to thank the participants for great questions and their engagement. Please remind everybody to fill out the feedback form that will be emailed to you right after the session. I want to thank Esther and the LCDA team for always, again, keeping us up on important topics and working so diligent to make sure that diversity works and is in front of everyone. So thank you, and everybody again for participating. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Ralph. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, everyone. Don't forget to fill out your feedback forms. We're
All
wonderful.
right.